I used to think all Muslims were terrorists. 3 years ago, I became a Muslim. I'm 38, white, and from the United States. And in this video, I'll cover what changed my mind about Islam, the hardest part about converting, and what I believe now about Islam that I didn't before. 7 years ago, I went through a horrible, devastating divorce 6 months after my son was born. At the time, I had a very successful business, and so I did have money, but I was extremely unhappy because the divorce just completely wrecked me. I believe that God sometimes gives you things like money to test you, to see what you do with it, and I obviously failed. About 4 years, I was living what most men would consider the dream life. You know, I had parties, I had women, I had all of these things that men dream of, at least in America. But I wasn't happy. Every night I would go home and I would just wish that I had my family. I would feel this emptiness in my chest after, 7, 8, 9 hours of having fun. I would just not be happy. And I knew that at the end of the day, something was missing in here. I did not think I could get any more depressed until the day it happened. I noticed that my ex-wife suddenly had this sense of peace and she just seemed happy. And so I asked her, I said, what's going on? Like, what are you doing? And she tells me, well, I decided to convert to Islam. Now, full stop. You have to understand that I'm American. And in America, we are programmed to hate Muslims. Every TV show, every movie, every time you see a Muslim, you see an AK-47, Allah Akbar, just paints a horrible picture. And so, of course, I hated Islam. I hated Muslims. I thought they were all terrorists. And so when she told me this, I was devastated. And I immediately, I'll be honest, I became aggressive. I said, don't you dare teach our son that stuff. I threatened to take her to court. I was gonna spend every penny I had to try to take my child back so that he would not learn Islamic teachings or anything about being a Muslim. It was a really hard time for my family. So then my wife was smart enough to hand me the Quran, and she said, listen, read it. See if you find something you don't like. Now, I didn't tell her this at the time, but I've always been a big believer in know your enemy. And I had every intention to fight this, every intention to use every piece of information I could against her. And so I took the book and I thought, okay, I'm gonna learn about this religion. I'm gonna figure out exactly how to fight this because I do not want my son to be Muslim. Ain't no way, no how. So I started reading the book. And believe it or not, I didn't find much that I didn't like, but I was still very skeptical. And so I really thought about it. I really thought about it, and I read the family values, I read the things in it about being a good person and giving charity, and I thought, okay, all right, this maybe I was lied to. Maybe America, and at least the Western society lied to me a little bit about Islam. Maybe this isn't quite what they told me it was. Maybe it's not that bad, but I still wasn't sold. I thought about it and I was like, well, wait a minute. If I send my son out into the world, if I send him to school, if I let society tell him how to live, he'll have a bad day and they'll tell him that he needs to dye his hair blue and become a girl or an infinite gender or just something wacky that, look, if you thought I hated Islam, I hated that stuff even more. And so I thought about it and I was like, well, if he's Muslim, there ain't no way that's gonna happen. If he's not Muslim, it could happen. And so I thought about it and I was like, trans-Muslim, 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 Muslim. So I called my wife up and I said, listen, you can teach him Islam. And she was absolutely shocked. But I was making an executive decision as a father, in my mind, at the time, the lesser of two evils. Now, at this point, I really needed to understand the religion that my son was going to be taught. So I actually picked up the Quran and I started reading it. I started going to the mosque, to these little events they would have, like the children's events and the bazaars and whatnot. And I noticed that there was so much in the Quran that was amazing. There was so much about the religion that was literally like, if you were to take how the West paints a picture of Islam, and you put it here, and then you put the actual religion of Islam here, they're like two completely different religions. And so I began to feel like I was lied to. Like I was told, hey, these people are bad, they believe in X, Y, Z, but in reality, they believed in ABC. And so I also noticed that when I went to the mosque, if there was a poor person, the imam would ask for money, you'd give him the money, and he would hand it to the poor person. And the mosques were just as nice as they needed to be to get the job done. When I remember going to because I grew up Christian, when I went to Christian churches, I remember the preachers having, sometimes a Rolls Royce, and they would just waste money on things. And look, no shade against Christians, but for me, it just seemed more genuine to give money and have them immediately hand it to a sister who needed it, who was struggling to feed her family, not put it in a collection jar and just hopefully maybe it'll make its way through the Rolls-Royce dealership, maybe to the poor people. And so I just noticed all these things and I thought, man, this is a beautiful religion. Now, at the time, I was dating a girl and it was going well, but for me, there was things that I did not agree with that were very Western. Things like, hanging out with other guys privately and, going on trips by yourself while hanging out with other men, and just things that I was not comfortable with. And it created conflict, and I ended the relationship. Now, I did not really realize this at the time, but that was a very Muslim thing to do. Like if you have a relationship with a man or you're married or something like that, you shouldn't be hanging out with other dudes. It's just like a basic. And I didn't need to be Muslim to feel that way. And so, that relationship ended and I was very depressed because now I had no one. I still was unmarried. I couldn't see my son all the time. And so my wife, my ex-wife at the time, noticed how depressed I was and she sent me a tafsir. And it was called Message for the Sick, because I was really, really depressed. And again, I reiterate, I had a lot of blessings in my life. Money, health, things like this, my parents both being alive, and I was still so miserable. And so she sent me this Message for the Sick. I read it, and when I read it, it just made everything come together for me. And I read it, and I said to her, we were actually in the car when I read it, and I said, take me to the masjid. I should have done this a lot sooner. And I went to the masjid, and I took Shahada. And everyone was around, and they were treating me like I was like a superstar, like I didn't even understand why at the time. It was, because all your sins are forgiven, everything is forgiven, and you're like the cleanest of them. And, I had noticed before that the Muslims were the nicest people I had ever met. And so that is how I changed my mind about Islam. Once I converted, or reverted, I said to my wife soon after, I said, listen, you're Muslim, I'm Muslim. I'm a completely different person. Of all things that are permissible, that Allah hates the most is divorce. I said, let's get our family back together. And she agreed, and we did. And we got remarried. We went to the masjid, we did nikah, and then we spent some time in the US. We moved to Costa Rica for a couple years, and then we moved here to Dubai because we wanted to live in a Muslim country where we could easily find halal food and we could easily go and pray. And it's been an amazing life ever since.